Hello. As I mentioned at the beginning of the service, today is Safeguarding Sunday, a day set aside by the Church of England to specifically focus on safeguarding and what that means for us. However, the lectionary readings were set decades ago, before Safeguarding Sunday was a thing. So I was looking at the readings and wondering if I should pick something different that had a more obvious safeguarding connection. After all, this passage from Luke was picked to mark the tail end of the church year, when we're looking towards the second coming and it's all quite apocalyptic. But the more I looked at it, the more I realised that this kind of dramatic and slightly daunting passage does say something to us in the context of safeguarding. Because in this passage, Jesus doesn't hold back from speaking the truth, even though it is not what his disciples want to hear. They want to hear how Israel will be built up, not how the temple will be destroyed. They want to hear how the Messiah will take on Rome and take up the reins of power himself, not how his disciples will be persecuted. It makes for slightly strange listening for us, and must have made for very uncomfortable listening for those early disciples. But Jesus does not shy away from a difficult topic. He doesn't pretend everything is going to be okay when it's not. He brings out the challenges of life into the open. And one of the greatest challenges to creating a safe culture in our church and in our community is a reluctance to ask questions and to speak truth when it is uncomfortable. Those who commit abuse rely on the silence of others in order to continue, whether that silence is because of shame or doubt or fear. But one of the greatest gifts we can give our community is to be people who listen well, people who ask good questions, people who are not afraid of the truth, even when that is difficult. The church is actually one of the biggest providers of safeguarding training in the country. If you can imagine how many people here have done some safeguarding training and multiply that by all the churches around the country. But that training is not meant to be kept within our walls. Safeguarding doesn't stop when you leave the church building. If we can take those safeguarding skills that we learn into our wider community, it is a way of being a blessing. And we might be a blessing in all sorts of unexpected ways. Statistically, all of us will know not just one, but probably many people who are or have been victims of abuse. People who are living in fear or who are carrying guilt or shame around with them from things that happened recently or long ago. And someone is far more likely to initially disclose abuse to a friend than they are to a person in authority. So you're much more likely to hear something than I am, and I'm more likely to hear something from a friend than with my collar on, if you like. But through safeguarding training and awareness, hopefully we will each be people who are able to respond well. Statistically, it's also very likely that a number of us here today have experienced abuse. And so if anything today touches a nerve or raises questions, do feel free to speak to me or to Kate or to Helen, our safeguarding officer. Actually, Helen, can you give a little wave in case anyone doesn't know who you are? There we go. Helen is excellent. She's our safeguarding officer and keeps us all on track with all the things we're meant to do and helps us think about things and reflect on them. Or you might need to speak to a friend or just take some space in church or outside if you need to. There is never any shame in seeking support. Often safeguarding can sound like a scary or distant topic, but really it is just a framework that can help us to better love and care for the people around us. It can sound bureaucratic, but actually it is a deeply Christian, caring thing to do. It's a way of loving our neighbour. When we were talking about this at PCC a little while back, Kate had some really helpful reflections, and so I'm going to hand over to her to share some real-life experience of how we can make safeguarding not just a box that we tick, but a natural part of our culture that can be a blessing to those around us. So, over to Kate.
Thank you, Ellen. Can I just check the microphone's working? You can hear me? Yep, thank you. So recently at PCC, we were asked to think about who the vulnerable members of the congregation might be and how we would work to safeguard them. We were all aware of the need to make sure children and vulnerable adults are protected. We've all done the course. And we know that sadly various types of abuse are common and occur across all ages and all economic groups. We all know about church scandals involving the clergy in positions of power and trust. And yet quite a few people in the PC were unsure how to open up conversations with potential victims and how to offer that support. In my day job as a GP, I have these conversations at least once or twice a month. So Andreas asked me to put forward some ways of discussing these difficult issues for the wider congregation. So I've been working as a doctor for quite a long time now, and over the years I've made some mistakes. One of the first was about 30 years ago, after attending a domestic violence workshop whilst being a junior doctor in A&E. We were asked to be on the lookout for abuse and challenge the story of an accident or an injury that didn't feel right. Well, very next shift, a girl of 16 fell down the stairs. No idea how it happened. She just woke up at the bottom. She was uninjured, thankfully, but the course was ringing in my ears. So I took her to one side and asked her if anyone had pushed her down the stairs. And the inevitable complaint came from the parents, and I was slightly taken to task. The intention to have that professional curiosity was correct, and I might still query that situation today, but I would try and do it in a much more nuanced and subtle way. So I've learnt that time is on our side, especially in general practice, and I might see a patient several times over a long period before raising a concern. People will often drop cues, both verbal and non-verbal, and if we're open to seeing and hearing them, it might just give us pause to think. So recently a lady came in feeling very tired and achy all the time. Now I've known her a long time. She's healthy, active and fit. She's not someone we see very often, and she's not someone who's achy and tired. She mentioned there was a bit of tension at home with a busy family life and being the go-to person for everybody else's needs. But she looked rather tense as she said it. The tension was a non-verbal cue that there was more going on, and the subtle use of tension at home was a clear verbal clue to me as well. However, we are all entitled to feel stressed and busy and a little overwrought. So I left it there, but I suggested we did some blood tests to check for any physical causes of the tiredness. They were all normal, as expected, but I saw her again and probed a little deeper about her relationship, using open-ended questions that let her dictate how far we took the conversation, such as, what does your husband think might be going on? Well, she replied, we aren't really getting on. That's a shame. How long has it been difficult for? Ages. I'm exhausted by all the rowing and fighting. He's lovely with everybody else, but just seems to be irritated by me. Do you feel safe at home? Yes, I think so, but he does get aggressive at times. Has it been physical at all? No, but he intimidates me when he yells and points and gets mad. By asking open-ended questions, the person can choose how much to say. Is your husband violent? Would not have had the same result. We talked some more, and I gave her details of the Dash charity, which is open locally for anyone who's a victim of domestic violence at any level, and reassured her that whatever she wanted to do, I'd support. And we talked about whether counselling was an option for them. She did not want to end a long marriage if this was a fixable problem. She is not a stereotypical abused woman, but someone who's going through a very difficult patch, which might escalate, or it might settle down. She knows that I know, and that in itself is helpful. She didn't need me to fix the situation, but just allow her to explore her feelings in a safe way. My long-term knowledge of her allowed me to suspect a problem, as her physical health has always been good and the story did not fit. The subtle clue tipped me off, but I felt I had to tread carefully. Abuse can lie in any relationship, and one of the saddest situations for me was an elderly lady in her 90s who was struggling to cope with her husband's increasing frailty and really quite significant confusion. He had many physical and complex psychological needs. I'll call her Jean. We had lots of conversations and offered help in many different ways, but Jean was always reluctant to accept help from outside. Finally, I felt the time was right to probe a little bit deeper into this, and I offered an opinion that I felt her husband was actually really quite unreasonable and a bit unpleasant, and was this normal for him? Which is not a question you can ask without preparing the ground over several weeks. Yes, she admitted, he'd always been controlling, difficult to live with, but the good had outweighed the bad, really. So I said, so what stops you from having some help? Oh, I'm not allowed, she replied. Allowed? Yes, my stepdaughter manages the finances and she said no. So it transpired that this was a second marriage, and the two children from the first marriage did not have a lot of respect for Jean. The husband had set it up so that Jean was power of attorney for health and welfare, but his daughter, a solicitor by profession, would manage the money. She then gave Jean a housekeeping allowance, but she had no access to any other finance. Her husband was in agreement with this approach, which did make it really rather challenging. Somewhat daunted by this situation, we felt that we needed to speak to Jean's stepdaughter to get a little clarity, and actually I have never spoken to a more unpleasant person. Yes, she admitted, she did have control of the money, and no, she would not pay for carers because that was Jean's job as her father's wife. At that point, I was a little bit out of my depth, so I raised a formal safeguarding concern for my patient and her husband, both of whom needed extra support to meet his care needs, which were beyond what a normal 90-year-old could have achieved on her own. Social services were fantastic, and they often are, despite the bad press they get. They insisted that the husband was moved to a nursing home because his needs were not being met at home, and Jean was therefore relieved of her duty. We asked Dash to support Jean, and they helped her to remain in the house that the couple were living in because, of course, she didn't own it, and that was going to be a problem. I hope these examples of two real people have not made you too anxious. All we ever really do is ask open-ended questions, listen to the other person, watch their body language or subtle verbal clues. It's what most of us do every single day in conversation with family and friends. Reflecting words back to someone is a simple way to let the person know they can speak to you. You said you feel tense at home. You seem anxious. People who are not struggling will not be offended by a gentle inquiry asked with sensitivity. If your gut tells you something isn't right, check in and gently ask. Leave it open for the person to come back to you at a later date. Don't be anxious or scared to ask for help. If in doubt, check in with Ellen or Helen, anybody in the parish who can help you and get you some support. And in some ways, as Ellen said, it is as simple as loving one's neighbour as oneself. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Stop it. Ooh. It might feel on first glance like that's a very practical and not especially might feel a bit like you've had safeguarding training briefly instead of a sermon. But actually, we are called to love our neighbour. We are called, as our reading, Thessalonians said here, brothers and sisters, do not be weary in doing what is right. Sometimes when we hear safeguarding, we can feel weary. Oh, I've got to do my safeguarding training. I've got to get it up to date, whatever. But actually, it is just as simple as a way of showing love to our neighbour, a way of bringing things that are in the dark into the light so that they can be healed, and a way of hopefully being a blessing to our community, which is what we are all called to be. So do what you do. Go and be good friends. I'm sure all of you are doing most of this already, but just do it with confidence and with intention. And if you get stuck, if there's something that comes up, our safeguarding teams in church are excellent, and with the diocese as well. There have been a few instances where things have had nothing to do with church, but people have come to us going, yeah, I'm not sure about this. And actually we have that sounding board to see what's the next steps. Not for us to fix, as Kate said. We're not here to fix everything, but hopefully to direct people and support people as they seek healing and seek to bring things into the open. So, prayer is also good. If you ever have someone come to you and you're not sure what to do, I often say a prayer of God, just help me to listen well and help me to know what to say. And it's amazing how the Spirit can be at work in these very mundane and practical conversations. So trust God with it, trust your gut, and seek help where you need it. Amen.